The damage starts when the system creates a structural conflict between the job and the love and the passion, meeting a certain efficiency performance standard, and then the clinician either is forced to adopt to that performance standard or they default out and they go to another employer. I think it starts the moment the clinician starts making trade-offs.
Today is one of those ideas that sounds right. It still sounds right when it's coming out of my mouth until you actually look at what it's doing. Oh yeah, consequences of the actions. And the word today is efficiency. I don't think I've ever heard anybody argue against efficiency. It feels like the safest word in healthcare operations. I feel like it signals discipline, performance, control, but dun dun dun, what if the thing you've been optimizing is the exact thing breaking your clinic? Because here's the tension, as Larry writes in his new article, the more efficient clinics become on paper, the more clinicians churn, the more patients drop off, and the long-term revenue quietly erodes. So either the operator is wrong or the model is. So today, Larry's going to break down how this thing that felt safe and good and wholesome, efficiency, went from a useful concept to something that's actively working against clinical care, and why most platforms are chasing metrics that look good while destroying the outcomes that actually matter. So Larry, let's start with what we were talking about before we hit record. Let's make sure we understand the terms, because we don't want to make these terms nebulous. That's probably the first step in where we get in trouble.
No, that's exactly right. And whether we're talking about efficiency or scale or growth, these are very general terms that allow you to define them any way that you want. Left to our own devices, we tend to define them on a very narrow scale and a bias. So when we get to, the whole idea around weaponizing efficiency, I'm one of the guys who would say that because it shows up in the whole area around scheduling. And so let's take a step back for a minute. In my experience in multi-site operations, which is effectively 40 years, what I noticed, even as my companies, and I had a couple generations of this, or even go back to my military days, the most variable function that I've ever seen in a healthcare site, physical therapy clinic, dental clinic, primary care, is how you schedule. And you could be part of the same brand, but from one clinic to another clinic to another clinic, it is highly, highly inconsistent. And so what is our knee-jerk reaction? Our knee-jerk reaction is to make it more efficient or to optimize it, to increase productivity. And I've seen board decks, including recently, where somebody's talking about going from 11.2 to 11.3 productivity, as though that is really, really a goal that should be followed. In any event, the whole template around scheduling is where it becomes a weapon, and that's ground zero, because the scheduling template is where every abstraction about efficiency becomes sort of concrete, dogmatic, irreversible. Somebody in a home office or a consulting engagement, which is even further from the operating floor, decides what the optimal visit lengths, the optimal daily count, the units per visit, the ratio of support personnel. They run the math looks clean. They roll it out. And then, let's use physical therapy as an example. A therapist tries to explain to a 74-year-old woman with a new hip who's got, maybe mild dementia and a daughter who drove a long way to help her at the appointment, that they have 11 minutes left in the appointment. And so the therapist is thinking, my blocks of time, efficiency that's been pushed on me from corporate, and I've got this situation in front of me. And that's where it becomes a weapon. It becomes a weapon in the treatment room. And the worst part, we never blame the template. We never blame corporate.
Right.
The clinician does. Time management issues, not hitting productivity targets. And obviously all that compounds patient by patient, clinician by clinician. And somebody finally wonders why there's a retention problem and patient outcomes are drifting. It's a scheduling template did that. We just never put it on a metric dashboard.
So when operators do say the phrase, we need to be more efficient, what are they actually chasing? And why does that feel so seductive?
Yeah, what they think they mean is what I would call doing more with less, eliminating waste, getting rid of resources, sort of the Toyota production system, being lean, sort of the good stuff. But what they're actually doing more often than not is they're compressing parts of the clinical encounter that are really hard to measure, and therefore they're the easiest things to cut. The intake conversation that surfaces the real problem. I like my clinicians doing much more subjective talking, relationship building. Otherwise, things become transactional. that doesn't get counted in the minutes. You don't bill for a CPT code
Right.
around that. The
Right.
2 minutes at the end of the visit where the patient asks questions. And as you well know, based on survey data long term, the last thing we tend to do as medical practitioners is explain things to patient. That
Right.
doesn't get counted. Clinical reasoning, all those kind of things. And none of that shows up as a line item. It all does show up in the outcomes, though, eventually. But eventually is sort of too slow for a quarterly review, so that by the time a board or a company gets to it, at the end of it, they just start to cut out waste. And when what really gets cut is margin, and it's clinical margin, the buffer that allows really good care to happen under imperfect conditions. Management's tough because you have to give flexibility to your professionals. If it's PTs, you're a doctoring profession. If it's dentists, you have to give some professional leeway. And if that means once in a while a patient in the waiting room waits a little bit more and is disgruntled about it, that's probably okay. I'm not saying that's a good way to conduct their business, but those are the necessarily, the unintended consequences of good management. The unintended consequences of bad management is every patient gets seen on time. If you have a clinic that is celebrating that every patient is seen on time and nobody's disgruntled about waiting room time, then my guess is you have inefficiency, not efficiency.
Huh. All right. In the article, you bring up Taylorism and industrial efficiency. I like when you give examples in other industries and bring them in. Well, we found this in pin making or, car production, and we brought it over here. So where did healthcare go wrong in borrowing that industrial efficiency model?
Yeah, this is just my guess. I think that the moment somebody said that healthcare is a service business, and then a consultant heard service business and they thought manufacturing. That's my guess.
Yeah.
And so really, when you take manufacturing and Taylorism and the industrial efficiency framework, time and motion studies, specialization, standardization, throughput optimization, all that works brilliantly when your idea is to produce the same product every single time without variation. In fact, you need it. It works for steel. It works for semiconductors. It works for the assembly line of an auto plant. But it does not work when the product is relationships, and therapeutic ones at that. And the raw material is humans. Those are humans in pain who show up with a history. They don't come to get, they come there for a reason. Right. To get treated, not hell. They come for help. And so what we do is we want to, bad business says we treat them with efficiency. And when that starts to happen, watch out. In the 90s is when, at least my best recollection, when we got to this whole concept of, you're a little young for this, Jimmy, of managed competition and managed care, the utilization review movement. And the idea was that to apply rigor to what, effectively, if you think about healthcare, it was an artisan economy, right? And some of it was legitimate. There was a lot of waste, a lot of variation, practice patterns, real room for better improvements, variability in treatment of how we go about, no real protocols. So there was some reason to it. But the mistake was believing that this framework was, you could apply it any and everywhere. Right. You could standardize parts. Some do and most don't standardized when you're dealing with human beings. And what suffered was clinical judgment. That became a variable to be controlled rather than a capacity to be enabled. And when you really think of when doctors and therapists and dentists leave, it's because they've been infringed upon. They spent all these years in school. And what do? We do all this stuff to take that away from them. And so we're paying for that mistake, just with, very, very different terminology. And we have to think twice about that, because we look at turnover and retention data and burnout, but we don't look at really the underlying causes. And part of it is our insistence on being efficient.
You, in this article, you argue that the causal chain is actually backwards, that efficiency doesn't drive revenue. It's the other way around. So what actually does then?
What drives revenue?
Yeah.
So the conventional model runs efficiency, capacity, revenue, growth. That's the conventional model.
Right.
The actual model runs closer to this. Clinical quality, number one. Patient outcomes, word of mouth referral relationships, new patient volume, revenue margin growth. Let me think backwards on that a minute. The old model is efficiency, capacity, revenue, growth. The actual model should run closer to this. Quality is number one. Sounds like Ford Motor Company. Wasn't
Yeah,
that the
yeah,
one you used
yeah.
that many years ago?
Quality is number one, right?
So let's bring that to healthcare. That then leads to a drive on patient outcomes. Word of mouth referral relationships comes out of that. New patient volume then is generated, that sort of the network effects, then revenue margin, which obviously all that equals growth.
Yeah.
You see, big difference. So growth is the endpoint in both models, but one is based on efficiency, capacity, revenue. The other one is based on clinical quality, patient word of mouth, driving that to growth.
And those things are hard to put, as you've mentioned before, in a slide deck, or harder to measure. So what does this look like on the ground for clinicians? Where does efficiency start turning into burnout, or what you actually call, you're bringing in different words, which I liked, you call it moral injury?
That's exactly right. And I think it starts the moment the clinician starts making trade-offs, because I'm not letting clinicians off the hook, because their default goes from the love of care and compassion and empathy and outcomes and clinical intervention and the science to now I'm going to default to the company says I have to see this many patients per hour, this many units per patient. This is what I'm based on. My daily email tells me my productivity, where my bonus is based on that productivity. Well, what happens in all those examples is your incentives shift and you start to make trade-offs and your default mode mechanism changes. And that's the inflection point. Not when the schedule gets busy necessarily. Clinicians always expect to be busy. Not when the documentation, requirements are annoying. They're always annoying. The damage starts when the system creates a structural conflict between the job and the love and the passion, meeting a certain efficiency performance standard. And then the clinician either is forced to adopt to that performance standard, or they default out and they go to another employer, or they have kind of cognitive dissonance. When seeing a complex patient carefully puts you behind the productivity metrics. So what do? You hustle through it and don't do what you know is the right thing, avoiding the time spent with them because your incentives have shifted to either a dollar sign or a carrot, some type of reward system. And so we have to stop rewarding with carrots, incentives, and bells and all those kind of things. And we have to go back to liberating clinicians. What I find interesting is clinicians want autonomy. I'm not saying you get rid of all guardrails, but what you do is you get rid of the number of guardrails that you have and you create boundaries and autonomy within structure and accountability. And if a clinician's expected productivity is 11 and one day they see 13 and another day they see 9, you got to live with that. And managing a service-related business is as much a battle in what I call normalizing discomfort. You have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable and the fact that you can't have equal standards across them. I have some clinicians that are really more built around productivity. Maybe their patient mix is, more commercial. I have others that I want them staying within the elderly Medicare patients, and I know that their numbers are going to be less. But you know what? We do that in baseball. We're not going to give up on the great the great shortstop who's an incredible fielder, but their batting average is less. We want our center fielder to have the higher batting average, right? Those are just examples of how we professionalize it in sports, but somehow or another, we've made it an industrial experiment, B school project, and have really screwed it up in healthcare service businesses.
Plus, in baseball, when a guy's like 0 for 7, he's due. What do we say? He's due. He's a good hitter. Exactly. He's gonna go 7 for 8 in the next 3 games. That's what you know. You've described something called efficiency theater. You touched on a couple of those elements, but what are some common examples that operators are celebrating they're actually hurting them?
Yeah, efficiency theater. So someone opens a dashboard. The dashboard has green numbers. Everybody nods. Oh, it's green. It's not yellow. It's not red. But nobody asks what's downstream of the green numbers. And that's efficiency theater. It's the performance of sort of what I would call operational sophistication with no substance behind it. The metrics are clean, but the causality is unexamined. And the room sort of moves to the next slide, right? That's the theater of it. Nobody starts talking about how utilization rates that look strong because patients are seen at a high volume without any analysis of completion rates. You and I have talked about the visit cliff, dropout patterns, outcome quality, productivity numbers that hit benchmarks because clinicians have figured out how to make numbers work. They game the system. EBITDA margins that hold because overhead has been cut. So, all of this leads to really this sort of notion that there are intended, unintended consequences of all these things. Let's have an adult conversation about them. And don't expect the cleanest numbers. You're dealing with human beings all the time. You're dealing with no-show cancellation rates. So here's what tends to happen. Classic example. Well, now you're getting less number of new patients. So what do we do? See, got to do more marketing. We got to do more lead generation. We got to create more fun things in the funnel. But nobody ever answered the fundamental question. If your friends, family, and former patients, your word of mouth referrals went from 35%, most people don't even measure it, down to 20%. Why did that occur? And my guess is it typically occurred because you're emphasizing efficiency at the sake of outcome.
Well, efficiency feels like it's brought in to save money, but there's a moment in the article that you described the math actually flips. Efficiency saves money early, but in the long run costs millions. I remember the first time somebody explained to me what replacing a clinician actually cost in all the different aspects: recruiting, lost revenue. So why are operators missing that? Is it short term, feels good, looks good on a chart? And then long term, this plays out over and over again. It loses money or bleeds long term. What are operators missing about that?
Yeah, so I think the costs are distributed in such a way that doesn't fit really any standard financial model. If you think about standard financial models, we have a P&L, we have a cash flow statement, we have a balance sheet. But the dynamics that go between new patients, visits, lab costs, if you're in dental or something else, all of those things, there's no interplay that we look at. And so the turnover cost of losing, say, a senior clinician is very real. Recruiting, onboarding, ramp time, productivity gap, in credentialing now it takes 3 to 6 months. And so you have to factor the lost opportunity costs there. I've seen conservative estimates at 50 to 150% of annual salary. I tend to look at it more as what do they produce in a year? So you take a physical therapist, average production, just say for sake of argument, is $300,000. And add another 3 months to it, that's at $100,000 just there, plus your cost of replacement and onboarding, credentialing, and all those things. You're looking at, in some cases, 100 to 200% of the costs. Don't forget about the referral relationships. Let's say that clinician had a really strong referral source, good word of mouth. They had great quality. They leave, their business doesn't suffer as much, but you're missing out on it. And I think what we tend to do in healthcare services and in dental services, we forget that these practices are mini practices within a practice. I tell my dentist right now, I said, you are in private practice. Everybody is, even if you're within a practice. You work and live within the team. You don't live and work within the corporation. And in your team might be you and the dental assistants, and a PT, it might be you and a PTA and a tech. That's the team you got to be thinking about. And as a business owner, you have to respect that you're promoting a real estate agent and not the brand of the real estate agent, to use that context. And that's what I love about the business. If you do things right, you'll do it that way. Yes, you're at risk of losing people. It's your job to keep them. And but what we tend to do is we work hard at optimizing an efficiency and we drive them away.
Which brings up the next point, which is, finding someone is one thing, but retaining them is a different thing. And you mentioned several things in this conversation of how to keep people. We hear it over and over again: autonomy. So if throughput isn't the answer, what does real efficiently look like, or what should it look like? And what should leaders be measuring instead? I feel like you repeat the same thing over and over again, which is good because it means it's the answer. But what should they be measuring instead?
Yeah, so the list is, we've gone through this a couple different times. I keep scaling it down a little bit. Most of it isn't new. It's just not traditionally on the dashboard. I think episode completion rate, and I'll grant you that it's harder to measure, but with EMRs and AI now, I don't think it's as hard as it once was. And that is, what percentage of patients finish their plan of care, versus the drop-off cliff and all those things that go with it. The reason I say that, Jimmy, is because to me, that's a proxy. If they're not finishing, why? Sometimes it's for the right reasons. Most of the time it's not, though. And anything below 60% is, in my view, a clinical or operational problem. They just happen to be wearing a referral problems clothes. I think the same thing in dental is, there is such a thing as completion rate and treatment plan acceptance. And, so for dental, it'd be a little bit easier or a little bit different metric, but it's the same concept as how many are actually doing what was the intention. Dropout timing, when are they leaving? After the evaluation, and in dental and in behavioral health and in primary care and in PT, that's a real problem. The times are different, but they very much are. So in a PT realm, if that dropping out after the first visit, that's obviously a really tough sign. I think another one is referral source engagement. Are your top referral sources sending you more complex patients or fewer? Complexity is a proxy for trust. I used to hear this from referral sources that in many cases own their own physical therapy. We send you our difficult patients, right? The orthopedic surgeons who send you their family members, right? I think clinical outcome rate by clinician, not to rank people punitively, but to understand. And now what we do with AI is we're able to do it almost a daily if we wanted to, but we do kind of a weekly report card on our operating structure, not as a punitive measure, but as a monitoring measure. Because again, people generally like accountability within structure, or I should say autonomy within structure and accountability. So some elements of feedback, call it sophisticated, feedback. And none of these are exotic, Jimmy. They're just harder to collect. And management is made to be efficient, not to be what it should be, which is to have complex adult problems that you get to the table and you deliberate about and you address. When you oversimplify solutions, your own desire for efficiency and management is contributing to the problem of trying to be efficient clinically.
Right. Let's give a forward tease. What are you writing about next? What comes up next week?
So this next week, we're looking at, we've done efficiency, and now we're going to start looking at other concepts around efficiency that can be used, for the same concept. So I've got, 2 or 3 in the hopper. Let me give me a half a second here, then I'll we had growth, we had scale, we had efficiency. And now we're going to look at things like, teamwork, collaboration. Again, these are words that are great words, but what do they really mean?
And then where do they show up on the scorecard? How do you measure them? But you could easily go into an organization and say, there's no collaboration, there's no teamwork, but you weren't, I wasn't optimized. I'm not getting graded on that. Therefore I don't do that.
No, that's exactly right. So we're going to look at some of those kinds of things. Also going to look at, I'll tell you what's been on my mind lately, because I've had some people write me about this, and that is, they say, okay, our cost per visit has gone up. It used to be in a service business at 40 to 42%. Now it's above 50%. So in PT, that would be your cost of salary, wages, and benefits for your physical therapist is over 50% of your visit cost, right? Or is 50% of your net revenue. And remember, expenses of people are about 67% of your overall expenses, and about now a little bit over 50. How do we regain margin if we're not efficient? And so that's a problem I'm going to be tackling through my writing as well. And one of them, and then part of the solution, by the way, is not all that surprising. And that is those who manage best manage least. You got to cut overhead. You have to absolutely start learning to trust your therapists to make decisions and to do things the right way with limited guardrails and with the ability to hold them accountable. So we're going to talk about how to regain margin back in the business, because no margin, no mission. So you have to have, I do have capitalistic tendencies. I'm not against the profitability of all these kind of things, but how can you do that in a way that makes sense without trying to be overly efficient?
All right. If this episode made you a little comfortable, good. That's the point. This is one of those ideas that I think hides in plain sight. It looks like a warm and fuzzy, but can actually be weaponized against you. So if efficiency feels responsible, it feels disciplined, but if you didn't define it correctly, it could quietly dismantle the very thing you're trying to build. Make sure you check out Larry's Substack. It's called The Operator. The link is in the show notes. Until next week, Larry, thanks for digging into efficiency.
Absolutely. Thanks, buddy.